Hello there, welcome to HFY Quantum Pro. Here, helping one another makes the universe smarter. So, what we are waiting for? Let's begin our story.
Nobody remembered when Nadia Sorrell had last spoken during a briefing. The officers joked about it sometimes quietly between shifts. The Paul Yuri called her the empty chair. The Gren did not bother learning her name. She had been on the command deck of the Steadfast Horizon for 5 months, and in that time, she had contributed exactly nothing to any discussion, any debate, or any plan. She was fine with that. The Allied fleet was not fine with anything. 11 star systems had fallen to the Dravari swarm in under a year. Entire civilizations burned to ash. The swarm moved like a living storm. Millions of ships acting as one mind, one hunger, one unstoppable force. 3 Allied fleets had already tried to stop them. 3 Allied fleets had been torn apart like wet paper. Now there was one fleet left. For species, 209 warships, and one terrified moon called Cerulia, where 2 million Orani civilians waited to find out if they would live or die. Admiral Roshan Halloway commanded the fleet from the bridge of the Steadfast Horizon. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and the kind of calm voice that made people believe things might be okay even when they clearly were not. He needed that voice now more than ever because his war council was falling apart. Fleet Commander Ishari of the Paul Yuri wanted defense. She argued for a layered ring formation around Cerulia, shields overlapping, weapons covering every approach. Her species were strategists. They believed in patience, in letting the enemy come to you. Her bioluminescent skin pulsed soft blue when she spoke, which meant she was stressed but controlled. War Chief Dunn of the Gren wanted attack. He slammed his armored fist on the table and demanded they meet the swarm head-on, hit them before they could form up. His species were warriors born on a heavy gravity world. They did not understand retreat. They barely understood caution. The Orani delegation wanted to run. Their lead representative, a thin insectoid named Counselor Vaughn, clicked his mandibles nervously and suggested the fleet withdraw to the Miran corridor, regroup, and fight another day. No one pointed out that there might not be another day. Halloway listened to all of them. He nodded. He asked questions. He tried to find a middle ground. But there was no middle ground between charge, defend, and flee. In the back row, Nadia Sorrell watched. She had her data pad on her knees, tilted so no one could see the screen. On it, she had pulled up footage from the Battle of Seneth, the Second Fleet's final engagement with the Dravari. Everyone had studied this footage. Every analyst in the Alliance had written reports about it. The conclusions were always the same. The swarm was too fast, too coordinated, too numerous. There was no weakness. Nadia was not looking for the same things everyone else had looked for. She rewound a particular segment. 14 seconds of chaos in the upper left quadrant of the battle. A cluster of Dravari ships breaking formation for just a moment before snapping back into perfect sync. Every other analyst had flagged it as a sensor glitch. Nadia had watched it 41 times. It was not a glitch. She paused the footage and zoomed in. The cluster had hesitated. Not all of them, just the ones on the outer edge. The inner ships had moved first, and the outer ships had followed a fraction of a second later. A delay so small that no standard analysis software would catch it. But Nadia was not using standard analysis software. She was using her eyes. The briefing ended with no resolution. Halloway dismissed the council and told them to reconvene in 6 hours. The officers filed out, muttering and frustrated. Ishari glanced at Nadia as she passed and said nothing. There was nothing to say to someone who never spoke. Nadia stayed in her seat until the room was empty. Then she pulled up more data. Battle of Krev, Battle of the Own Passage, Battle of Pale Reach. Every engagement where the Dravari had fought Allied forces. 37 battles, 37 defeats. She was looking for the hesitation. She found it in 11 of them. Not always in the same place. Not always the same duration. But the pattern was there, a tiny stutter in the swarm's perfect coordination, always at the edges, always radiating outward from a central point. Something was relaying commands. Something specific. Something that, if it stopped relaying, left the surrounding ships momentarily blind. Nadia wrote a single line in her notebook. She underlined it 3 times. They are not one mind. They are a chain. She closed her notebook, tucked her data pad under her arm, and walked to the archive deck. It was late. The corridors were empty. Her boots echoed on the metal floor. She passed a viewport and stopped for a moment to look out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Dravari swarm was coming. 41 hours away and closing. A billion teeth in the dark. Nadia looked at the stars for a long time. Then she turned away and kept walking. She had work to do. The archive deck smelled like recycled air and old data cores. It was the least visited section of the steadfast horizon, a long, dim room filled with storage banks and terminals that most officers only accessed remotely. Nobody came here in person anymore. There was no reason to. Nadia had been here for 9 hours straight. She had pulled every Dravari engagement record the Alliance had ever collected. Not just the battle footage, the raw sensor logs, the communication intercepts, the debris field analyses, the energy signature readings. Data that most analysts skimmed through once and summarized in neat reports. Nadia was not skimming. She was drowning in it on purpose. She played the Battle of Krev on one screen and the Battle of Pale Reach on another, running them side by side. She watched the Dravari formations move. Millions of ships flowing like water, curving around Allied defenses, splitting and reforming without any visible hesitation. A perfect hive mind. That was what every report said. That was what every expert believed. But Nadia had found the cracks. She slowed the footage to 1/10 speed, then 100th. At that level, the delays became visible. Not to a computer. The numbers were too small for any automated system to flag as significant. But to a human, I trained to spot what did not belong. They were there. A cluster of ships in Sector 9, moving half a heartbeat before the cluster in Sector 10 responded. A wave of Dravari in the lower quadrant, adjusting course a fraction of a second after the wave above them. Relay. Response. Relay. Response. It was not a hive mind. It was a network. And somewhere inside that network, there were ships whose only job was to carry the signal from the center to the edges. Nadia leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes. She had not eaten since yesterday. Her neck ached from hunching over the terminal. She picked up her notebook and looked at what she had written over the past hours. Pages of numbers, timestamps, coordinates, lines connecting dots, a web of relationships that nobody had ever mapped because nobody had ever thought to look. She thought about the farm where she grew up, a quiet colony on a quiet world. Green fields, slow days. She had been a strange child who sat at the edge of the yard and watched insects instead of playing with other kids. Her mother used to say she was just shy. Her teachers said she lacked motivation. The aptitude tests said she was average. None of them had known what she was actually doing. She was watching. She was learning. She was seeing the patterns that other people walked past without noticing. When she joined the fleet at 19, she had no ambition. She did not want to command ships or win medals. She ended up in signals intelligence because someone needed to fill a desk, and she was the one standing closest to it. But it turned out that staring at screens full of noise and finding the signal hidden inside was exactly what her brain had been built for. She had once identified a hidden minefield by catching a delay of 0.003 of a second in background radiation pulses. The pulses were supposed to be natural. Every sensor had classified them as natural. But Nadia had watched them for 6 hours and noticed that natural radiation did not repeat at intervals divisible by 7. That discovery had saved a convoy of 12 ships and 4,000 lives. Her commanding officer had written a short commendation. Nobody remembered it now. Nadia turned back to her screens. She was building a model, not on the ship's main computer, where it would be reviewed and questioned and delayed by committees, but on her personal terminal, using code she had written herself. Simple code, ugly code, but it worked. She fed in the data from all 37 battles. She told the program to look for the delays, to map them, to find the ships at the center of each relay chain. The program ran for 40 minutes. When it finished, Nadia stared at the results. 17 ships. In every battle, There were between 12 and 23 ships in the swarm that acted as signal relays. Pulse ships, she called them. They looked identical to every other Dravari vessel. Same size, same energy output, same hull configuration. No scanner in the Allied fleet could tell them apart. But the delays could. If someone watched the battle in real time and tracked the micro-hesitations as they rippled through the swarm, they could identify the pulse ships by where the delays originated. Destroy those ships, and the network would break. Not completely. The Dravari would still fight, but they would lose coordination. Sections of the swarm would go blind, moving on instinct instead of intelligence. The problem was simple and terrifying. No computer could do this. The delays were too subtle, too buried in noise. It required a human mind, one that could see patterns in chaos the way Nadia saw them, one that could watch a battle involving millions of ships and pick out the 17 that mattered. She would have to do it herself, live, during the fight. A sound behind her made her jump. She turned and found a small Orani engineer standing in the doorway, antennae twitching with curiosity. Nadia recognized her. Pike, from the sensor maintenance team. "You have been here a very long time," Pike said. "Are you all right?" Nadia looked at her for a moment. "I think I found something," she said. Pike waited. Nadia turned back to her screen. She was not ready to explain. Not yet. She needed to be sure. She needed the numbers to be right, because if she was wrong, people would die for nothing. She ran the model again. Pike came back 3 hours later with food. Nadia did not hear her enter. She was deep inside the data, her eyes moving between 4 screens at once, her fingers tapping coordinates in her model so fast that the keys blurred. The archive deck was cold. The environmental systems ran minimal power here because nobody was supposed to spend this long in this room, and Nadia's hands are stiff, but she did not notice. Pike set a tray on the edge of the console. Warm broth, a piece of flatbread, a cup of something that smelled sweet, an Orani nutrient drink that tasted like honey mixed with grass. Beside the tray, Pike placed a small object, a charm carved from cerulean crystal, pale blue, no bigger than a thumbnail. It was the kind of thing Orani gave to people they worried about. Pike did not say anything. She simply sat on a storage crate near the door and waited. When Nadia finally looked up 20 minutes later and saw the food, she blinked confused, as if she had forgotten that eating was something bodies required. She picked up the broth and drank it without taking her eyes off the screen. The model had run 5 times now. The results were consistent. 91% confidence. In the language of statistics, that was strong. In the language of war, it meant 9 out of 100 times the theory was wrong and everyone who trusted it would die. Nadia stared at the number. She thought about the screening force that would be sent into the swarm's teeth to buy her time. She thought about the pilots who would fly strike missions based on her word. She thought about the 2 million Orani on Cerulia who were counting on a fleet that did not yet know it had a plan. 9% chance of being wrong. She closed her eyes and pressed her palms against the cold console. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips. Fast, unsteady. She opened her eyes and pulled up the data one more time. Not the model this time, the raw footage. The Battle of Seneth. The moment that had started all of this. She watched the cluster of Dravari ships hesitate in the upper left quadrant. She watched the delay ripple outward. She watched the pulse ship at the center, a vessel no different from any other, no larger, no brighter, no more threatening, send its signal and pull the swarm back into formation. She could see it so clearly now. It was like looking at one of those old pictures that hid a second image inside. Once you saw it, you could never unsee it. The Dravari were not a storm. They were a machine, and every machine had parts that could break. But the breaking had to be precise. Destroying random ships would do nothing. The swarm was too large, too redundant. You had to hit the pulse ships, and you had to hit them in the right order, starting from the edges and working inward, peeling the network apart layer by layer. If you hit the central relays too early, the outer pulse ships would adapt, find new routes, rebuild the chain. The attack had to be surgical, and it had to be guided by someone who could read the delays in real time. Nadia had tested herself against the recorded battles. She replayed them at full speed and tried to identify the pulse ships as the data flowed. The first time, she found 6 out of 15. The second time, 11. The third time, 14. By the seventh replay, she could spot them within seconds of the delay appearing. Her brain was doing something that no computer in the fleet could replicate. It was not processing the data faster. It was processing it differently. She was not calculating. She was feeling. The pattern had a rhythm, and she could hear it the way a musician hears a wrong note in a symphony. She picked up the orany charm Pike had left and held in her palm. It was warm from the ambient heat of the console. She thought about Pike sitting quietly on that storage crate, not asking questions, not demanding explanations. Just being present, just caring. Nadia was not used to that. She had spent most of her life being overlooked, and she had made peace with it. She did not need attention. She did not need praise. But she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone notice she existed. She put the charm in her pocket. Then she opened a new file on her terminal and began writing a report. Clear, simple, no jargon, no speculação, no aging, just the facts. The Dravari swarm was not a hive mind. It was a relay network. The relay nodes could be identified through microdelay analysis during active combat. Destroying the nodes would fragment the swarm's coordination. The analysis required a live human observer with pattern recognition capability. She read the report 3 times. She deleted 2 sentences that sounded uncertain. She added 1 line at the end. I can do this. She saved the file. She stood up. Her knees nearly buckled. She had been sitting for 14 hours. She steadied herself on the console and took a breath. The Dravari swarm was now 26 hours away. The fleet was still arguing about whether to fight, defend, or run. And a woman who had not spoken in a briefing in 5 months was about to walk into the admiral's office and tell him she had found the key to winning the war. Nadia left the archive deck. The corridor was empty. Her boots echoed in the silence. She did not feel brave. She felt terrified, but she kept walking. Admiral Holloway was reviewing casualty projections when the door chimes sounded. He looked up from his desk, expecting his aide or perhaps Ishari with another defensive formation proposal. Instead, a woman he barely recognized stood in the doorway. Short, dark hair pulled back, eyes that looked like they had not closed in 2 days. Lieutenant Sorrel, she said, as if reminding him. Signals intelligence. He gestured her in because he did not have a reason not to. She entered, stood in front of his desk, and did something he was completely unprepared for. She talked, not in the halting, quiet way he had heard her speak the few times anyone addressed her directly. She spoke clearly, steadily, and with the kind of focus that made it impossible to look away. She laid her datapad on his desk and walked him through her findings step by step. The microdelays, the relay structure, the pulse ships, the 91% confidence interval, the targeting method, the requirement for a live human observer. Holloway listened without interrupting. He was a man who had commanded warships for 22 years, and in that time, he had developed an instinct for 2 things: people who were guessing and people who were sure. Nadia Sorrel was sure, not confident in the loud, chest-thumping way that war chieftain was confident. Sure in the way that a person is sure when they have checked their work 7 times and know, down to the bone, that the numbers are right. When she finished, he asked one question. You're saying you can identify these pulse ships during a live battle, in real time, while the swarm is trying to kill us? Yes, she said. No Josetashin. No Qualifors. He called Dr. Solen. The Paul Urey chief science officer arrived with the skepticism her species was famous for. She took Nadia's datapad, sat down, and spent 40 minutes going through the model line by line. The room was silent except for the soft clicking of Solen's long fingers on the screen. Nadia stood by the wall and waited. Holloway watched them both. When Solen looked up, her bioluminescent skin had shifted from its usual calm green to a deep, unsettled violet. I cannot find an error, she said. The methodology is unorthodox. The code is not elegant, but the conclusions are supported by the data. She paused. How did your automated systems not detect this? The delays are below the threshold of standard analysis filters, Nadia said. The software treats them as noise. And you did not. No. Solen stared at her, for a long moment. Then she turned to Holloway. "Admiral, I believe this warrants serious consideration." Holloway called the War Council. The reaction was exactly what Nadia had expected. Ishari studied the data with careful interest, her analytical mind drawn to the elegance of the pattern even as her cautious nature resisted trusting it. War Chief Dunn dismissed it outright. He called it ghost hunting and demanded to know why the entire fleet should gamble its survival on invisible delays measured by a junior officer nobody had heard of. Counselor Vaughn of the Orani was more measured. He asked how many pulse ships would need to be destroyed to make a meaningful difference. Nadia told him, between 8 and 12, based on estimated swarm size. Vanes antennae tremblet. 8 ships, out of millions. It sounded impossible and miraculous at the same time. The argument went back and forth for an hour. Nadia did not participate. She had said her piece. She stood in the corner with her hands clasped behind her back and her eyes on the floor. She was not being meek. She simply had nothing more to add. The data spoke for itself. Either they believed it or they did not. It was Holloway who ended the debate. He stood, placed both hands flat on the table, and said, "We are adopting this plan." Dunn growled. Ishari raised a hand to object. Holloway cut them both off. "Every strategy we have discussed so far leads to the same outcome. We lose. Commander Ishari's defense buys us hours at best. War Chief Dunn's charge buys us minutes. Counselor Vaughn's retreat buys us nothing because there is nowhere left to go." He looked at Nadia. "Lieutenant Sorrell is offering us something none of those plans have. A chance." The room went quiet. Holloway issued orders. The fleet would deploy in a modified crescent. A screening force of heavy ships would engage the swarm directly, absorbing punishment and keeping the enemy active so the delay patterns would emerge. A strike wing of fast corvettes would stand by for rapid response targeting, and Nadia would be placed in the Combat Information Center with a dedicated console wired directly into the fleet's entire sensor array. Pike volunteered as her technical assistant before anyone asked. The little Orani engineer appeared at the CIC within the hour, already running cable and configuring data feeds. When Nadia arrived and saw the setup, she looked at Pike. "You did not have to do this," she said. "You did not have to find the pulse ships," Pike replied. "But here we are." The fleet had 16 hours. Ships began repositioning. Pilots were briefed on new protocols. Engineers rerouted power to sensor systems that had never been pushed this hard. In the Combat Information Center, Nadia sat at her new console and ran a calibration test. The data streams were clean. The feeds were live. She could see every ship in the fleet, every sensor reading, every background signal. She closed her eyes. She opened them. She was ready. The Dravari arrived like nightfall. One moment, the long-range sensors showed empty space. The next, the entire forward display turned black with contacts. Not hundreds, not thousands. Millions. The swarm poured out of faster-than-light transit in a wave that stretched across the tactical map from edge to edge, blotting out the stars behind it like ink spilled across glass. In the Combat Information Center, every screen flickered as the sensor systems struggled to process the sheer volume of data. Pike's hands moved fast across her terminal, filtering, prioritizing, keeping the feed stable. Beside her, Nadia sat perfectly still. Her eyes were open. Her hands rested flat on the console. She was not looking at any single screen. She was looking at all of them. On the bridge, Holloway gave the order. "Screening force, engage." The Grin heavy cruisers pushed forward first. 12 massive warships, each one built like a fortress, their hulls scarred from a dozen previous battles. They hit the leading edge of the swarm and opened fire. The space between them erupted in light. Plasma bolts, railgun slugs, missile trails cutting bright lines through the dark. The Dravari answered with their own weapons, and the cruisers began to shake under the impact. Behind them, the Paul-Uri frigates swept in from the flanks, firing quick bursts and pulling away before the swarm could concentrate on them. The Orani drone carriers launched everything they had, clouds of tiny automated fighters that swarmed into the gaps between Dravari ships, biting and stinging and dying in flashes of orange fire. The battle had begun. In the CIC, Nadia watched the chaos unfold across her screens. The data was overwhelming. Millions of signals, millions of movements. The noise was so dense it was almost physical, pressing against her mind like a weight. She needed to find the rhythm inside it. She needed to hear the wrong notes. Minutes passed. 3, 5, 7. The screening force was taking heavy damage. A Gren cruiser lost its forward shields and began venting atmosphere. Two Paul Yuri frigates collided while evading a Dravari swarm cluster. The drone carriers were burning through their reserves at triple the expected rate. On the bridge, Holloway gripped the edge of his command chair and stared at the tactical display. He could see the numbers turning red. Ships lost. Pilots dead. The clock was running, and the woman in the CIC had not said a word. Ishari's voice came over the command channel. Admiral, the screening force cannot sustain this rate of attrition. If the pulse ship theory is incorrect, hold the line, Holloway said. His voice was steady. His hands are not. In the CIC, Nadia's eyes moved. Left screen, right screen, center. The data flowed past her like a river, and she was standing in the middle of it, letting it wash over her, waiting for the current to shift. She was not thinking. Thinking was too slow. She was feeling, listening with a part of her brain that had no name. 11 minutes in, she felt it. A ripple, a hesitation so small it would not have registered on any instrument. A cluster of Dravari ships in Sector 7 adjusting their formation a fraction of a second after the ships beside them. The delay was not coming from the front of the cluster. It was coming from behind, from one specific ship, sitting in the middle of the formation like a heartbeat. Sector 7, Grid 44, Nadia said. Her voice was flat and calm. The ship trailing the second cluster by 0.3 seconds. Pulse ship, the strike wing moved. For fast corvettes, peeled away from the reserve formation and dove into the swarm. They were small and quick, built for exactly this, punching through enemy lines, hitting a single target, and getting out. They found a ship Nadia had marked. They fired. The pulse ship died in a flash of white light. And 800 Dravari ships went blind. The effect was instant. The entire section of the swarm around the destroyed relay lost its coordination. Ships that had been moving in perfect formation began to drift. Some turned in circles. Some fired at empty space. Some collided with each other, their hulls crumpling like tin. The Allied ships in that sector, moments ago fighting for their lives, suddenly found themselves shooting at targets that could not shoot back. The CIC went silent. Every officer in the room turned to look at Nadia. She did not look back. She was already scanning the next sector. Sector 12, Grid 91. Pulse ship. The strike wing fired again. Another section of the swarm collapsed. Over the next 2 hours, Nadia called 17 targets. Her voice never rose above a conversational tone. She never paused, never hesitated, never second-guessed. Each call was followed by a strike, and each strike tore another piece of the Dravari network apart. The cost was brutal. The screening force was gutted. 31 ships gone. The strike wing lost 6 of its 10 corvettes. A Gren cruiser detonated close enough to the steadfast horizon to crack the bridge viewport and throw Holloway to the floor. Alarm screamed through the ship. Nadia did not flinch. She kept her eyes on the screens. She kept calling targets. By the 3rd hour, the Dravari began to break. Not retreat, break. Fragments of the swarm scattered in different directions, fleeing without coordination, without purpose. The great hive mind that had consumed 11 star systems was stumbling, confused, broken into pieces that no longer knew how to be whole. Cerelia was safe. On the bridge, the crew began to cheer. In the CIC, Pike reached over and gently placed her hand on Nadia's arm. Nadia looked down at the small, orny hand and then at Pike's face. Her own hands were shaking. She had not noticed until now. The fires took 2 days to go out. Wreckage drifted in a field that stretched for thousands of kilometers around Cerelia. Twisted metal, shattered hulls, frozen clouds of atmosphere that had once filled living ships. Recovery teams moved through the debris in small shuttles, searching for survivors, marking the dead, cataloging what was left of 41 Allied warships that would never fly again. 9,214. That was the number. Nadia read it on the casualty report and sat with it for a long time. She did not know how to hold a number like that. It was too large for grief and too small to be abstract. Each one had been a person. Each one had been breathing, thinking, afraid, alive. And now they were aligned in a report. But 2 million Orni on Cerulia were still breathing. The math was ugly, but the math was real. Admiral Holloway convened the surviving fleet commanders in the Steadfast Horizon's main hull 3 days after the battle. The room was damaged. A support beam had buckled during the shockwave that cracked the bridge, and temporary bracing held up one corner of the ceiling. Nobody cared. They were alive to stand in a damaged room, and that was enough. Holloway spoke first. He gave credit to the screening force, to the strike wing pilots, to the engineers and medics and damage control teams who had held the fleet together with their bare hands. Then he turned to the back of the room where Nadia stood, as she always stood, quietly, near the wall. The architect of this victory, he said, is Lieutenant Nadia Sorrell. Every eye in the room found her. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the bulkhead. Fleet Commander Ishari stepped forward. She was the tallest person in the room, her bioluminescent skin glowing a steady, warm gold, the Paul Uri color of deep respect. She pressed her palms together in front of her chest, and the light flowed down her arms and pooled at her fingertips. Then she bowed, slowly, until the glow touched the floor. It was a gesture reserved for those who had saved something sacred. War Chief Dunn was next. He did not bow. The Gren did not bow. Instead, he crossed the room in 3 heavy steps, stopped in front of Nadia, and placed his massive hand on her shoulder. His grip was firm enough to make her knees buckle slightly. He held it for 5 seconds, staring into her eyes without blinking. Then he released her, nodded once, and walked away. In Grin culture, that gesture meant he considered her a warrior equal to any who had ever carried a weapon. Counselor Vaughn of the Orni came last. He carried a small box, and inside it was a crystal from Cerulia, pale blue, flawless, about the size of a closed fist. It caught the overhead light and scattered it into tiny rainbows across the walls. Vaughn's voice trembled when he spoke. This stone is taken from the deepest cavern of our homeworld. We give it only to those who have saved a world. In 10,000 years of Orni history, it has been given 11 times. He placed it in Nadia's hands. 12 now. Nadia held the crystal. She looked at it. She looked at the room full of officers and commanders and warriors, all watching her, waiting for her to say something. She said, "Thank you." And that was all. Later, when the hall had emptied and the corridors had gone quiet, Nadia walked to the engineering bay. She found Pike working alone, repairing a sensor relay that had burned out during the battle. The little Orni was elbow-deep in circuitry, her antennae twitching with concentration. Nadia reached into her pocket and pulled out the charm Pike had left beside her food that night in the archive deck. She set it gently on Pike's workstation. Pike looked at it. Then she looked up at Nadia. "Thank you for the food that night," Nadia said. It mattered. Pike's antennae rose high, the Orni equivalent of the widest smile a face could hold. "You look like you needed it," she said simply. They stood together for a moment in the quiet hum of the engineering bay. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. That evening, Nadia returned to her quarters. She sat on her bunk and opened the fleet's official after-action report on her datapad. She scrolled through pages of analysis, tactical summaries, damage assessments, and commendations. Near the end, she found her own contribution listed under a single line. Tactical analysis provided by Lieutenant Nadia Sorrell, Signals Intelligence Division. She read it twice. She almost smiled. Then she closed the report and opened a new file. Fresh Travari signal data collected during the battle. The swarm was scattered now, broken and fleeing, but it was not dead. It would regroup. It would adapt. The Pulse ship network would change. The delays would shift. If the Alliance wanted to survive the next encounter, someone would need to stay ahead of the changes. Someone who could hear the patterns. Nadia picked up her pen and opened her notebook to a fresh page. She began to write. Outside her viewport, The stars burned cold and steady over Cerulia. Recovery shuttles drifted through the wreckage like fireflies. Somewhere out in the dark, the remnants of the Dravari swarm were running. And for the first time in a year, the galaxy was not afraid. It would be a long time before historians understood what had happened here. But when they finally pieced it together, they would trace the turning point of the war back to a single truth that no alien species had expected. The quietest person in the room had been listening the whole time. And when she finally spoke, she changed everything.